The Taliban leaders' wives lived in silence and control, while their husbands held power. But when the power shifted, that protection ended instantly. Trapped inside the same harsh system their husbands helped create, they faced a brutal fate with no way out. If we go back to the early 1990s, Afghanistan was torn by war, but it was still a place where women had space in public life. After the Soviet troops left in 1989, the country fell into chaos. Warlords fought each other. Kabul, the capital city, was hit by constant shelling and gun battles. Streets were unsafe. Ordinary families lived in fear. People fled their homes for safer places. Schools were damaged. Hospitals struggled to stay open. Despite the violence, women had made real progress over the decades. In the 1960s and 1970s, laws encouraged equal rights, and women joined schools and jobs in big numbers. By the early 90s, women held many important roles in cities. They made up almost 70% of teachers in Kabul, and large number of doctors, nurses, writers, and civil workers. Many women studied at universities and worked in offices. They did jobs that built the country. Girls and women walked in the streets of cities like Kabul, Herat, and Mazar-e-Sharif without having to follow strict dress codes. They wore simple scarves or no head covering at all. They moved freely, went to markets, and met with friends or colleagues during the day. Schools were open to both girls and boys. Yet these freedoms were uneven. Afghanistan's cities were more progressive than rural villages. In many rural areas, traditions already expected women to stay home, wear coverings, and follow strict male supervision. Still, even in some rural regions, women helped harvest fields or care for livestock alongside men. These roles were not seen as political power, but they were vital. They helped families survive hard times. The war made everything fragile. Schools struggled to open every day. Teachers went unpaid or moved to refugee camps in Pakistan or Iran. Many families pulled girls out of school just to keep them safe. Yet by the early 1990s, women in cities still held jobs and could imagine a future where their daughters would learn and grow. As the fighting continued, a new group called the Taliban was rising in the east and south of Afghanistan. These were young men from religious schools, many of them with no real experience in government or peace building. They promised an end to war and crime. They said they would restore order. For some Afghan families, that promise sounded hopeful. In September 1996, the Taliban marched into Kabul and took control of Afghanistan's capital. They declared a new government called the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan. For the first time in years, one group seemed to rule most of the country. Almost immediately, the Taliban began reshaping society. Women were told they could no longer go to school. Girls' classrooms were shut. Women who worked as teachers, doctors, nurses, clerks, and civil servants were forced to quit their jobs and stay home. Before this, women worked in more than a quarter of government jobs and were crucial in running schools and hospitals. With them gone, public services collapsed. Education for girls was banned. At first, younger girls were quietly pushed out of school classrooms. Then by 1998, the Taliban ordered that only girls under 8 could learn at home, and only if they studied religion. Private schools for girls were shut down too. This caused women's literacy to fall to some of the lowest levels in the world, with rates as low as 13% in cities and 3% in rural villages. For women who needed medical care, life became even harder. Female patients could only be treated by female doctors and nurses. But since women were banned from working, female health workers were mostly gone. Maternal deaths skyrocketed, and it became harder for women to get basic care during pregnancy or childbirth. Everywhere in the country, women were restricted from leaving their homes without a male guardian. This could be a husband, father, brother, or even a son. If a woman were seen in public alone, she could be beaten or publicly punished by the Taliban's religious police. The streets, once busy with market traders and shoppers, now saw almost no women. The wives of Taliban leaders lived under these same restrictions. These men held real power over Afghanistan, but their wives were expected to follow the same rules as everyone else. They stayed inside their homes or compounds. They wore the burqa if they went out at all. They did not have careers. They were not seen at official events or in radio broadcasts. Their roles were private. Their voices were silent. Many Taliban leaders practiced polygamy, meaning they had more than one wife, a tradition permitted in some interpretations of Islamic law up to 4 wives. Many commanders married young women from local communities, or even arranged marriages with families for social or political reasons, not personal choice. These marriages showed how the system treated women like objects tied to power and status, rather than as people with freedom. Even though these leaders were powerful, their wives could not appear in public or speak freely. Their roles were confined to family life and obedience to social rules. Behind closed doors, they lived in strict seclusion. Contact with people outside the home was limited. If their husbands were away, fighting, or negotiating, these women waited, quietly, sometimes fearful of what each day might bring. For ordinary Afghan women, daily life was brutal. They could not educate their daughters. They could not earn money. Many families sank deeper into poverty because they lost half their workforce when women were banned from jobs. For the wives of leaders, the fear was different. They had power by marriage, but no power over their own lives. In October 2001, everything changed fast. After the attacks of September 11th, the United States, along with allies like Britain, launched airstrikes and ground operations in Afghanistan. Their goal was to remove the Taliban and destroy the network that had been given shelter inside the country. By December 2001, the Taliban government collapsed. Its leaders fled Kabul. Many crossed into rural areas or escaped across the border into Pakistan. The first Taliban regime was over. For Afghan women, this moment felt like a door opening after years of darkness. Girls went back to school. Women returned to work. Universities reopened their doors to female students. In cities, women walked outside again, often wearing headscarves instead of full body coverings. Women's voices slowly returned to public life. New laws promised equal rights. A new Afghan government, backed by international forces, spoke openly about women's education and freedom. But this change was fragile from the start. Outside major cities, fighting never fully stopped. The Taliban didn't disappear. They regrouped in villages, mountains, and border areas. By 2003, they were launching attacks again. Roads became dangerous. Schools were burned in rural areas, especially girls' schools. Teachers were threatened or killed. Over time, the war spread back into daily life. Between 2001 and 2021, more than 170,000 people were killed in the conflict, including civilians, soldiers, and fighters. Millions were displaced. Children grew up with checkpoints, explosions, and funerals as normal events. This long war shaped an entire generation. During these years, the wives of Taliban leaders lived in constant uncertainty. They were not living normal family lives. Their husbands were either fighting, hiding, or moving between secret locations. Many women were taken from one safe house to another. Some stayed in remote Afghan villages. Others lived in refugee areas in Pakistan, especially in places like Quetta or Peshawar, where Taliban networks quietly operated. These women lived under strict secrecy. Phones were limited, names were hidden, photos were avoided. Any public exposure could put their families in danger from airstrikes, raids, or arrests. For safety, their identities were erased from public view. This is why there are almost no records, images, or interviews from this time. Some wives raised children alone for long periods. Fathers would disappear for months or even years. Some never returned. If a husband was killed or captured, the wife had little protection. There were no official systems to help them. They depended on extended family or local support networks just to survive. Many children in these families grew up without stability. They saw whispered conversations. They saw phones hidden under clothes. They learned early not to ask questions. Mothers carried the emotional weight of keeping families together while living in fear. This period was not freedom for these women. It was survival. They were not part of public celebrations of women's rights, but they were not free from Taliban control either. By the late 2010s, it became clear that the war was not ending. Peace talks began in Doha. Foreign troops prepared to leave. Inside Taliban families, another waiting period began. Something big was coming. In August 2021, the waiting ended. As US and NATO forces withdrew, Afghan security forces collapsed faster than expected. Province after province fell without long battles. On August 15, 2021, the Taliban entered Kabul. The Afghan president fled the country. The government dissolved in days. For Taliban fighters and their families, this was seen as a victory. After 20 years of war, the men had returned to power. But for women across Afghanistan, fear returned just as fast. Within weeks, the Taliban began bringing back the same restrictions from the 1990s. The rules were no longer vague or loosely enforced. They were written, announced, and pushed into daily life step by step. Every part of a woman's routine was watched. Where she could go, how long she could stay, what she could wear, who could walk by her side. The rule of traveling without a male guardian applied everywhere, from cities to villages. It applied to poor women and wealthy women. It applied even to the wives of Taliban officials who still lived inside Afghanistan. As a result, many women stayed inside their homes for days or weeks at a time. Simple tasks like visiting a doctor, buying food, or seeing relatives became difficult or impossible. Education for girls was slowly erased again. Girls above primary school age were barred from classrooms. By 2022, secondary schools for girls were closed nationwide. In 2023, women were banned from universities. This meant millions of girls and young women lost their chance to learn. Families watched their daughters' futures disappear. Mothers who once dreamed of education for their children had nothing to offer but silence. Work opportunities also vanished. Women were removed from government jobs, offices, aid groups, and media. Even markets became places of fear. Women were forced into separate areas or blocked entirely. Many families lost their main source of income overnight. Hunger spread fast. Mothers skipped meals so children could eat. The Taliban also reshaped the legal system. Courts that once included trained judges were replaced with religious courts run by men loyal to the regime. Women were banned from working as lawyers or judges. A woman could no longer defend herself in court. If she was beaten, forced into marriage, or denied her children, there was no place to seek justice. The law did not protect her. In this world, the wives of Taliban leaders lived in a strange and painful position. Their husbands held power over the country, yet these women had no power over their own lives. They did not appear in public. They did not represent the government. Their role was to obey and remain unseen. There were rumors that some Taliban families lived partly outside Afghanistan. Some children were sent abroad for schooling. Some wives were said to have traveled with passports. These stories spread quickly because they clashed with the reality faced by ordinary women, who were beaten or flogged in public for clothing violations or walking alone. These punishments were meant to frighten others. Many women never recovered from the shame and trauma. Under this system, the lives of Taliban leaders' wives became even more tightly controlled. Publicly, they were invisible. Even as wives of powerful men, they were expected to stay out of sight. Journalists inside Afghanistan reported that Taliban leadership demanded strict obedience from all women, including those in their own families. Dress rules applied inside official compounds. Any public mistake by a woman connected to leadership could damage a man's status. Very little is known about the individual wives of Taliban leaders. This is not an accident. The Taliban does not allow these women to be seen or heard. There are no official records about them, no public photos, no interviews. Their names rarely appear anywhere. What is known comes from reports, leaks, and people who observed the system from the outside. After the Taliban returned to power in 2021, several officials took additional wives. These marriages often involved young women and were arranged through families or tribal ties. Age gaps were common. Power played a strong role. These marriages were less about personal choice and more about status, loyalty, and control. Once married, these women entered homes ruled by strict customs. Their lives were tightly managed. They were not treated as equal partners. They were expected to obey their husbands and elder men in the family. Travel required permission. Education was often stopped completely. Inside the home, even small decisions were not theirs to make. Choices about children's schooling, visitors, or daily routines were guided by male authority. If a husband disagreed, the woman had no safe way to resist. There were no support systems, no courts to help her, no shelters to protect her. Divorce was rare and dangerous for women. If a marriage ended, a woman could lose her children. Custody usually went to the father or his family. This fear kept many women trapped in unhappy or abusive situations. Silence became the safest option. Control over women's bodies, voices, and choices was not a side effect. It was the system itself. Their names may be unknown. Their stories may be hidden. But their suffering is real. And it mirrors the fate of millions of Afghan women forced to live without freedom, protection, or a voice. As conditions for women worsened inside Afghanistan, the outside world began paying closer attention. Governments, courts, aid groups, and human rights organizations followed what was happening with growing concern. Reports coming out of Afghanistan painted a clear picture. International legal bodies began collecting evidence. Investigators looked at Taliban laws, public announcements, and punishment records. In July 2025, the International Criminal Court took a major step. It issued arrest warrants for top Taliban leaders. The warrants targeted Hibatullah Akhundzada, the Taliban's supreme leader since 2016, and Abdul Hakim Haqqani, the Taliban's chief justice and one of the main authors of its harsh legal system.
My office has concluded that these two Afghan nationals are criminally responsible. Our action signals the status quo for women and girls in Afghanistan is not acceptable.
Akhundzada rarely appears in public, but every major order restricting women since the Taliban returned to Kabul in August 2021 has been issued under his authority. Abdul Hakim Haqqani oversaw the courts that enforced bans on girls' education, women's work, travel without a male guardian, and even access to basic health care. The ICC said these actions were not accidents or local decisions, but part of a clear, organized policy aimed at controlling women and girls across the country. After the warrants were announced, the Taliban rejected the court's authority and refused to cooperate. No arrests followed because Afghanistan is not under ICC enforcement control, and the Taliban leadership does not travel to countries that would detain them. Still, the warrants had real consequences. They officially labeled Taliban leaders as international suspects, blocked any hope of global recognition, and increased pressure on states that quietly dealt with them. Human rights groups also gathered stories from inside Afghanistan. They documented women who lost their jobs overnight, teachers who were sent home, journalists who disappeared from television screens, students who were told their education was over. These groups reported that women had no courts to turn to and no police willing to protect them. If a woman was abused or punished unfairly, there was no safe place to complain. The system no longer worked for her. Aid organizations warned of disaster. By 2022, Afghanistan faced a deep humanitarian crisis. When women lost jobs, families lost income. Hunger increased. Children dropped out of school. Mothers struggled to keep households alive under growing poverty. Yet even as the crisis deepened, women were banned from many aid roles, making it harder for help to reach those who needed it most. While the world issued statements and reports, daily life inside Afghanistan did not improve. Fear stayed constant. Women learned to stay quiet. They avoided eye contact in public. They stayed inside as much as possible. Every outing felt risky. Every rule break, even accidental, could bring punishment. The wives of Taliban leaders lived through the same system, though in isolation from public view. Some were protected from hunger and violence because of their position, but protection came at a cost. Their silence was demanded. Their freedom was limited, controlled, and fragile. So while the world watched from the outside, these women lived unseen. Ordinary women suffered openly. Leaders' wives suffered quietly. Different lives, same fear. And that silence became one of the strongest signs of how deep the control really was.